Ra sent his most powerful weapon to destroy humanity. Her name was Hathor, the goddess of love. She waded through the carnage with what the ancient texts describe, without apology, as evident satisfaction. Ra watched from above and realized he had made a mistake. He had wanted punishment. She had decided on extinction. And once the eye of Ra was sent, there was no simple way to call it back. The solution that saved humanity was 7,000 jars of beer, dyed red to look like blood, poured across the fields before dawn. It worked. She drank. She looked up. She felt only warmth. Tonight, we are not in the realm of kings and cosmic succession disputes. Tonight, we step into the wider Egyptian divine court, the gods that ordinary Egyptians actually lived with, the goddess who was simultaneously the patron of love, of mining expeditions, and of the dead, the crocodile god, whose sacred animals wore gold earrings, the divine potter who formed every human being on his wheel, body and soul, simultaneously. The goddess so ancient that even the other gods wrote her letters asking for advice. These are the deities that Egyptians carried on their bodies, whispered to at household shrines, and tucked into their children's clothing as small fired clay figures before sleep. We begin with the one who almost ended everything, and then chose not to. Hathor, Egyptian Hut-Hor, meaning House of Horus or Mansion of Horus, is one of the most ancient and theologically complex goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon, with attestations reaching back to the early dynastic period, and a presence in religious texts and material culture that spans the entire 3,000-year duration of pharaonic civilization. Her epithet, Nebet Nebut, gold of the gods, appears in New Kingdom hymns and captures something of her particular luminosity within the divine order. She was understood as the embodiment of a quality of divine radiance that exceeded even the solar brightness of Ra, a warmth rather than a heat, a fertility of light rather than its burning intensity. Her iconographic forms are more varied than almost any other Egyptian deity, which itself reflects the breadth of her theological domain. She appears as a cow, or as a woman with cow's ears, or as a woman wearing a headdress consisting of a solar disk cradled between two cow horns, the headdress that would later be adopted by Isis and that became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in Egyptian religious art. She appears as a lioness in her fiercer solar aspect, as a woman holding a sesheshet, the ritual rattle that was her primary cult instrument, as a woman with the head of a cobra in her role as the Uriu's goddess, and, in a distinctive regional form, as a pillar or column crowned with her characteristic cow-eared face. A form known as the Hathor capital that appears throughout Egyptian temple architecture from the Old Kingdom onward. The diversity of her forms is not iconographic inconsistency, but theological amplitude. Hathor was not a specialist deity with a single bounded domain. She was understood as a fundamental quality of the divine, the feminine generative power of the cosmos, expressed differently in different contexts. Love, beauty, fertility, music, dance, intoxication, foreign trade, motherhood, mining, the afterlife. All of these fell within her purview, and the apparent variety of her forms reflects the variety of contexts in which that fundamental quality manifested. Hathor's relationship to Ra, and specifically her identification as one form of the Eye of Ra, the feminine solar power that Ra could project outward from himself, is foundational to understanding her theological position. We discussed this concept in episode 1 in the context of Tefnut, and it applies with equal force to Hathor. She was the solar eye in its generative, life-giving, brilliantly luminous aspect, as distinct from Sekhmet, who was the solar eye in its destructive, burning, plague-bringing aspect. Both were Ra's eye. Both were the same divine force differently expressed. This identification is explicitly stated in a number of New Kingdom hymns and ritual texts. The Dendera Temple Complex. The great temple of Hathor at Dendera in Upper Egypt, whose standing ruins date primarily to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, approximately 54 BCE to 34 CE, but incorporate earlier structures and preserve much older theological material. Contains a series of hymns that describe Hathor as the Eye of Ra who has no equal, the Golden One who illuminates with her beauty, and she who fills the sky with her rays. These are solar descriptions applied to a goddess whose most common associations in popular thought are with love and music, a conjunction that makes more sense once Hathor's solar identity is understood. Love, in Egyptian theological thought, was not separate from solar energy, but was its most characteristically generative expression, the warmth that makes things grow. The myth in which Hathor's solar identity is most dramatically displayed is the myth of Ra's vengeance, a New Kingdom text preserved in several versions, most completely in the Ptolemaic period Book of the Celestial Cow, recovered from the tomb of Seti I, Valley of the Kings, Cuthifith 17, approximately 1279 BCE, and from 3 other royal tombs. The myth recounts that Ra, grown old and sensing a loss of respect among humanity, dispatched his eye, Hathor, to punish those who had spoken against him. Hathor descended to earth in her leonine form and began to kill. The text describes her wading through human blood with evident satisfaction. Ra, observing the carnage, repented. He had intended punishment, not annihilation, and the goddess had exceeded his intentions. He could not simply call her back. Once sent, the Eye of Ra acted according to its own nature, and its nature in this mode was destruction. The solution was a specific and practically detailed piece of divine improvisation. Ra commanded his servants to grind a large quantity of red ochre, or in some versions mandrake, and mix it into 7,000 jars of beer, producing a liquid that resembled blood. This was poured out over the fields before dawn. When Hathor arrived at the killing grounds and saw what appeared to be the aftermath of a great slaughter, she drank, became intoxicated, and lost the focused ferocity that had been driving her violence. She looked up, saw the world around her, felt only warmth and contentment, and the destruction stopped. The aftershock of this myth in Egyptian religious practice was substantial. The festival of drunkenness, Tek, was celebrated annually, particularly at Dendera and at the temple of Mut at Karnak, as a ritual commemoration of the moment when Hathor's destructive power was subdued by intoxication and transformed back into her generative, loving aspect. Participants consumed beer in quantity, music was played, and the general atmosphere was one of deliberate, sanctioned excess, a ritual inversion of normal social behavior, that reenacted the divine transition from destruction to creation. The festival is attested from the New Kingdom onward and continued into the Roman period. Papyrus records from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb workers on the west bank of Thebes, document the allocation of beer rations for festival purposes in quantities consistent with large-scale communal celebration. The Sekhmet was a rattle-type percussion instrument consisting of a handle surmounted by a loop frame strung with metal rods or rings that produced a distinctive metallic hissing sound when shaken. It was Hathor's primary cult instrument, used in her temples and in rituals associated with her throughout Egypt, and its sound was understood as theologically efficacious in a specific way. It pleased the goddess, calmed divine anger, and was associated with the rustling of papyrus reeds in the wind, a sound connected to the primordial creation and to the marshes of the delta where Horus had been hidden in infancy. Sekhmets have been recovered from Egyptian archaeological contexts in extraordinary numbers and in a wide range of materials: faience, bronze, silver, gold. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, the Cairo Egyptian Museum, the Louvre, and virtually every major collection of Egyptian antiquities includes examples. They range from rough, functional instruments to finely worked ritual objects with elaborately modelled Hathor faces at the juncture of handle and frame. The goddess's face, the broad, frontal, cow-eared face of Hathor, peers from the instrument itself, transforming it into a portable image of the deity, as well as a musical tool. The sound of the Sekhmet was not merely pleasant. Egyptian ritual texts describe it as actively protective, capable of dispersing malevolent forces, maintaining the goddess's benevolent presence in a space, and signaling the beginning and end of ritual actions. Professional Sekhmet players, female musicians attached to Hathor's cult establishment, occupied positions of genuine social prestige in Egyptian society. The title, Chantress of Amun, or Chantress of Hathor, held by women of various social classes, from priestesses to the wives of craftsmen, indicates that musical service to the goddesses was a respected institutional role with recognized status, documented in administrative texts, on personal stelae, and in tomb biographical inscriptions throughout the New Kingdom and Third Intermediate periods. Hathor's connection to the afterlife, which might seem incongruous given her primary associations with joy and sensory pleasure, derives directly from her solar identity and her geographical association with the West. The West was the direction of sunset, the direction of the Nile necropolis. In most Egyptian cities, the tombs were on the west bank of the river, and the direction of death. As a solar goddess, Hathor was naturally associated with the setting sun, with Ra descending into the dirt, and therefore with the threshold that the dead crossed on entering the underworld. The epithet Ementet, Lady of the West, was one of Hathor's most important funerary titles, and in this aspect she was depicted as a woman emerging from the western mountain, or from the branches of a sycamore fig tree at the edge of the desert, offering water and food to the souls of the newly dead. The sycamore fig, Ficus sciaecomoris, was a sacred tree strongly associated with Hathor in Egyptian funerary contexts, understood as her physical manifestation in the landscape at the boundary between the inhabited Nile Valley and the desert necropolis. Paintings from New Kingdom private tombs, particularly from the Theban necropolis, in tombs such as T52, Nakhiti, T55, Rahmose, and T69, Mena. Frequently depict the deceased and their families approaching the sycamore goddess and receiving her gifts, a visual formulation of the hope that Hathor's welcome awaited them at death. The 7 Hathors, a group of 7 manifestations of Hathor who appeared at the birth of a child and determined its fate, functioned as divine analogues to the fates of Greek mythology, though attested considerably earlier. They appeared at the threshold of life as Hathor appeared at the threshold of death, marking with their presence the moments at which individual existence was most precarious and most in need of divine attention. The 7 Hathors were invoked in magical texts for the protection of newborns and in amulets worn during pregnancy, creating a theological continuity between birth and death that was characteristically Egyptian. Hathor presided over both transitions, welcoming souls in and welcoming them out. Sekhmet, from the Egyptian Sekhem, meaning power or might, is the lioness goddess, the most ferocious of the solar eye deities, the embodiment of the destructive potential of solar heat at its most extreme. Where Hathor was the solar eye as warmth and generativity, Sekhmet was the solar eye as burning, plague, and righteous violence. The 2 goddesses represent complementary poles of the same fundamental divine force, a duality that Egyptian theology held together without discomfort, and that is explicitly articulated in texts that describe the transformation of one into the other as a shift in mood or circumstance rather than a change of identity. Sekhmet is depicted as a woman with the head of a lioness, wearing a solar disk and urias on her head. The choice of the lioness, specifically the female lion rather than the male, is deliberate and theologically precise. The lioness in Egyptian thought was the more dangerous of the 2 sexes. She hunted, she killed, she protected her cubs with ferocious intensity. The male lion was associated with royalty and with the sun in its majestic, supervisory aspect. The lioness was associated with the active hunting, killing expression of solar power. Sekhmet was dangerous in the way a hunting lioness is dangerous, purposeful, efficient, and entirely without mercy for her designated prey. Her primary cult center was Memphis, where she was part of a divine triad with Ptah, the great creator god of Memphis, and their son Nefertem, the god of the lotus and of healing unguent. This Memphite triad is attested from the Old Kingdom period and continued as a significant theological grouping throughout pharaonic history. The pairing of Sekhmet with Ptah, the god of craft, creation, and careful making, is at first glance paradoxical. What does the goddess of destruction have in common with the patient god of artisanship? The answer lies in the Egyptian understanding of medicine, which Sekhmet also governed. The physician who could send plague could also lift it. The power to harm was the same power as the capacity to heal. Sekhmet's doctors, the Waish priests of Sekhmet, a specialized medical priesthood, practiced both magic and physical medicine, and their authority derived from their goddess's dual mastery of disease and cure. One of the most remarkable archaeological expressions of Sekhmet's cult is the enormous series of granite statues commissioned by Pharaoh Amenhotep III, reigned approximately 1388 to 1351 BCE, and installed in his mortuary temple at Kom el-Hitan on the west bank of Thebes. The same temple whose colossal seated statues survive today as the Colossi of Memnon. Amenhotep III had approximately 700 statues of Sekhmet carved from granodiorite quarried at Aswan, each depicting the goddess in her standard seated or standing form with a lioness head and solar disk. These were not decorative commissions. They had a specific ritual function. The statues were installed in pairs representing Sekhmet at the two moments of the Egyptian day most associated with dangerous solar transitions: sunrise and sunset. The number of statues, 700, or in some calculations closer to 730, meaning 2 statues for each day of the year, allowed the temple's priests to perform a different ritual at a different statue each day, cycling through the entire series over the course of a year, and thereby maintaining continuous propitiation of the goddess of plague and disease. The theological logic was precise and practical. Sekhmet could send epidemic disease as a manifestation of solar heat gone wrong. Continuous ritual attention kept her pacified, and her destructive potential redirected toward Egypt's enemies. The statues were not merely representations of the goddess. They were cult instruments in an ongoing disease prevention program. Many of these statues were subsequently removed from Kom el-Hitan and redistributed across Egypt, to the Karnak temple complex, to the Mut temple enclosure, to other religious sites, a process that continued through the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period. The result is that Sekhmet statues from Amenhotep III's original commission are now found in museums around the world: the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, the Cairo Egyptian Museum, and dozens of others. When you encounter a seated lioness-headed goddess in a collection of Egyptian antiquities, there is a reasonable probability that it originated from this single extraordinary royal commission of the 14th century BCE. The WHB priests of Sekhmet, Wahab meaning pure in Egyptian, a term for a category of priests who maintained ritual purity, constituted a specialized medical ritual clergy whose functions combined what we would now distinguish as priestly duties and medical practice, but which Egyptian culture understood as a single integrated activity. Disease in Egypt was not categorized as either natural or supernatural in the modern sense. It was understood as potentially involving both physical causes, intestinal worms, infected wounds, imbalances of bodily fluids, and divine or demonic causes, and an effective healer needed to address both dimensions. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, New York Academy of Medicine, approximately 1600 BCE, but containing material from perhaps 2500 BCE, is the oldest surviving surgical text in the world and represents the empirical rational dimension of Egyptian medicine. 48 case studies of traumatic injuries, described with clinical precision, with diagnoses and prognoses ranging from an ailment I will treat to an ailment not to be treated. It makes no reference to divine causation and recommends no ritual interventions. The Ebers Papyrus, Leipzig University Library, approximately 1550 BCE, by contrast, intermixes pharmacological recipes with magical spells in a way that treats both as equally valid therapeutic tools. Both approaches existed within Egyptian medical culture, and the WHB priests of Sekhmet were practitioners of the integrated tradition. The relationship between Sekhmet and epidemic disease is documented in specific texts that describe the messengers of Sekhmet, divine agents who carried plague at her command, particularly during the dangerous transitional period at the end of the old year and the beginning of the new, when the boundaries between ordered and chaotic states were considered especially permeable. The epagomenal days, the 5 extra days at the end of the calendar year, the birthdays of the Osirian generation, as we discussed in episode 2, were considered particularly dangerous periods when Sekhmet's messengers moved freely. Protective rituals performed by the YHB priests during these days were understood as essential public health measures in the theological framework of the time. Bastet. Egyptian Bast or Bastet, a name whose etymology is uncertain, possibly related to a word for ointment jar, given her association with protective unguents, underwent one of the most dramatic theological transformations in Egyptian religious history. A gradual shift over roughly a millennium from a fierce leonine solar goddess closely related to Sekhmet to a domestic cat goddess associated with gentleness, fertility, and household protection. This transformation is not simply a matter of changing iconographic fashion. It reflects a genuine theological repositioning, a redistribution of divine attributes between two related but distinct cult identities. In her earliest documented forms, attested from the Second Dynasty, approximately 2890 BCE onward, Bastet was a leonine goddess, depicted either as a lioness or as a woman with a lioness head, functionally similar to Sekhmet, and sometimes described in texts as essentially interchangeable with her. Both were solar eye goddesses. Both were associated with Ra's protective and destructive power. Both were linked to the burning intensity of the Egyptian sun. The distinction between them in the Old Kingdom period was primarily geographical. Bastet's primary cult was in the delta city of Bubastis, Sekhmet in Memphis, rather than characterological. The shift in Bastet's iconography from lioness to domestic cat, Felis catus, the species domesticated from the African wildcat Felis libica, appears to begin in the Middle Kingdom and is substantially complete by the New Kingdom, when Bastet is routinely depicted as a seated cat or as a woman with a cat's head, holding a sesheshet and a basket, or an aegis decorated with a cat's face. The theological implications of this shift were significant. The domestic cat was a gentler, more intimate, more household-oriented animal than the lioness, and Bastet's character softened accordingly. She became the patron of the home, of women and children, of fertility and sexual pleasure, of music and dance, a profile that overlapped considerably with Hathor's and that distinguished her clearly from the fierce, disease-sending Sekhmet. Bastet's cult city was Bubastis. Egyptian, Per Bastet, House of Bastet, modern Tel Basta, located in the northeastern Nile Delta, near the modern city of Zagazig. The city served as the capital of Egypt during the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, approximately 945 to 715 BCE, a period sometimes called the Bubastite dynasty, when pharaohs of Libyan origin ruled from this northeastern delta city and naturally elevated the goddess of their capital to unusual prominence in state religious practice. Archaeological excavations at Tel Basta, conducted most extensively by Egyptian and European missions in the 19th and 20th centuries, have recovered temple remains, a substantial cat cemetery, and numerous bronzes and faience objects associated with the Bastet cult. The festival of Bastet at Bubastis was described by the Greek historian Herodotus. Histories 259 to 60, approximately 450 BCE, in terms that suggest it was among the largest and most well-attended religious festivals in Egypt. Herodotus describes flotillas of boats traveling to Bubastis from throughout Egypt, carrying hundreds of thousands of participants. His figure is 700,000, which is almost certainly exaggerated, but may reflect genuine mass participation. The festival involved music, dancing, the consumption of wine in quantities greater than during the rest of the year, combined according to Herodotus, and the general inversion of normal social decorum that characterized festival time in Egyptian religious culture. The parallel with Hathor's festival of drunkenness is striking. Both festivals involved a domesticated, even joyful goddess. Both required ritual intoxication, and both may have functioned as controlled social releases of behaviors normally suppressed. The sacred cats of Bastet's temple at Bubastis were maintained with dedicated care. When they died, of natural causes, since harming them was a serious offense, they were mummified and buried in the associated cat cemetery. The scale of this practice was remarkable. 19th century excavations at Tel Basta uncovered what are estimated to have been hundreds of thousands of cat mummies, most of which were unfortunately destroyed or dispersed before systematic archaeological recording was possible. The surviving examples, now distributed across museum collections worldwide, show a range of mummification quality, from simple linen wrappings to elaborate bundles with modeled faces and painted details, consistent with the range of economic resources available to the different individuals who donated them as votive offerings. The practice of cat mummification and votive donation was not limited to Bubastis. Cat cemeteries have been identified at multiple Egyptian sites, including Beni Hassan, Spios Artemidos, and Saqqara, and the British Museum's collection alone includes more than 500 cat mummies. CT scanning of these specimens by researchers, including Lydia McKnight at the University of Manchester, has revealed that a significant proportion, in some studies, the majority, of votive animal mummies were killed at a young age specifically for the mummification trade, rather than dying naturally. This finding has reshaped scholarly understanding of the votive animal industry in late period and Ptolemaic Egypt. The sacred animals were not simply revered creatures who happened to die and were then preserved. A substantial industry of animal breeding, culling, mummification, and sale existed specifically to supply the demand for votive offerings at sacred sites. The domestic cat's position in Egyptian society was distinctive and extensively documented in both textual and material evidence. Cats are depicted in New Kingdom tomb paintings, most famously in the Theban tomb of Nebahmun, British Museum, approximately 1350 BCE, accompanying their owners on hunting trips in the papyrus marshes, sitting under chairs at dinner parties, wearing collars, and engaging in the various behaviors that anyone familiar with domestic cats will recognize as characteristic. These are clearly companion animals, valued members of households, present in the daily life of the Egyptian family in ways that go well beyond their practical utility in rodent control. The legal protection of cats in Egypt, the killing of a cat, even accidentally, being punishable by death according to Diodorus Siculus, Library of History 183, approximately 60 BCE, is sometimes dismissed as Greco-Roman exaggeration, but the underlying fact of special legal status for cats is consistent with the broader theological framework. A sacred animal, associated with a major goddess, required a level of protection that distinguished it from ordinary domestic animals. Whether the penalty was actually death in all cases is uncertain. That cats occupied a legally protected category is not. Sobek. Egyptian Sebek. A name of uncertain etymology, possibly related to a word meaning to impregnate, or connected to the crocodile itself, was the crocodile-headed god of the Nile, of water in its most primal and dangerous form, and of royal power in its most physically intimidating expression. He is attested from the Old Kingdom period, appearing in Pyramid Text Spell 317, where he is described as sharp of teeth, and maintained a robust cult presence throughout all subsequent periods of Egyptian history, with particular strength in the Fayum Basin and in Upper Egypt around Kom-Ombo. The Nile crocodile, Crocodilus niloticus, was the largest and most dangerous animal in the Egyptian environment. Adult males reached lengths of 5 to 6 meters and weights of up to 1,000 kilograms. They were ambush predators, capable of taking prey as large as cattle and as fast as the antelopes that came to the river's edge to drink. And they were present along the Nile in numbers that made them a genuine and daily threat to anyone who worked near or on the water. The Egyptian response to this threat followed the characteristic pattern of Egyptian religious thought. The dangerous animal was not merely feared, but elevated, given divine status, propitiated through cult, and thereby converted from a force of uncontrolled danger into a managed divine power, whose attention could be directed, or at least not arbitrarily hostile. Sobek was depicted as a man with the head of a crocodile, wearing either a solar disk and double-plumed crown, or the Ahtef crown, or simply the horns and disc associated with Amun-Ra. He was shown carrying the Was scepter and the Ankh, the symbols of power and life, which positioned him firmly within the mainstream of Egyptian divine iconography, despite his fearsome animal aspect. In some representations, he stands on a platform of water, or within a decorative motif of water signs, explicitly linking his divine body to the river. The Fayum, the large agricultural depression connected to the Nile by a canal and intensively developed during the Middle Kingdom, was Sobek's heartland, and the city of Shedid, known to the Greeks as Crocodilopolis and to the Romans as Arsinoe, was his primary cult center in that region. The maintenance of sacred crocodiles within temple precincts was one of the most distinctive practices of Sobek's cult, attested from the Middle Kingdom period and documented extensively by Greek and Roman visitors. The geographer Strabo, traveling in Egypt around 25 BCE, describes the sacred crocodiles of Crocodilopolis with characteristic precision. The animals were identified by name, fed by the priests with bread, meat, wine, and honeyed milk, and wore gold earrings and bracelets on their front feet. Individual worshippers presented food offerings directly to the sacred animals, and the priests opened the crocodile's jaws to receive each item. When the animals died, they were mummified and buried with ceremony in a designated sacred crocodile cemetery. The temple of Kom-Ombo in Upper Egypt, a double temple dedicated jointly to Sobek and to the falcon god Haroeris, a form of Horus, built primarily during the Ptolemaic period on earlier foundations, contains one of the best preserved crocodile cult contexts in Egypt. A dedicated chapel within the complex housed the mummified crocodiles and a large collection of crocodile mummies recovered from nearby cemeteries is now displayed in an on-site museum. CT scanning of these specimens by researchers at the University of Liverpool and other institutions, has revealed significant details about Nile crocodile biology, diet, and pathology in the ancient Egyptian environment, making the sacred animal cemeteries unexpectedly valuable sources of paleobiological data. The number of crocodile mummies recovered from Egyptian sites is substantial. Estimates run into the thousands, with specimens ranging from newly hatched hatchlings, possibly representing the offspring of the temple's breeding population, dedicated as votive offerings, to large adults several meters in length. The range of mummification quality parallels what has been observed in cat mummies, from careful, elaborately wrapped specimens with modeled linen faces, to rough bundles that CT scanning has revealed to be mostly sand and organic debris with a few genuine crocodile bones, suggesting the existence of fraudulent votive offerings produced to meet demand that the supply of genuine crocodile bodies could not satisfy. This discovery, made by researchers at the University of Manchester and published in scientific journals, including the Journal of Archaeological Science, has added considerable nuance to scholarly understanding of the late-period votive industry. Sobek's theological profile extended well beyond his role as the divine expression of crocodilian danger. He was a creator deity, specifically a creator associated with the primal, undifferentiated waters from which all things had emerged. Some Egyptian texts describe Sobek as rising from the primordial waters of Khnum at the beginning of creation, establishing his identity with the deepest layer of the Egyptian cosmological story. His connection to the Nile flood, the annual inundation that was the source of Egyptian agricultural productivity, gave him a generative dimension that balanced his destructive aspect. The same river that harbored the crocodile also delivered the black silt from which everything grew. Sobek's syncretism with Ra, as Sobek Ra, appears from the Middle Kingdom period and reflects the theological logic of combining the river's primal creative force with the solar creative force, producing a deity of exceptional generative power. The Fayum was understood in Egyptian religious geography as a particularly concentrated manifestation of the primordial Khnum, a lake, Lake Maurice, modern Birket Karun, in the middle of the desert, seemingly inexplicable in natural terms, which Egyptian tradition attributed to the creative presence of Sobek. The development of the Fayum as an agricultural region during the Middle Kingdom, through extensive irrigation and land reclamation projects carried out under the 12th dynasty pharaohs, particularly Amenemhat III, was understood as a collaboration between human engineering and divine power, and Sobek's temple at Medinet Mahdi, built by Amenemhat III and Amenemhat IV, is among the best preserved Middle Kingdom temple structures in Egypt. Khnum, Egyptian Khnum, a name possibly related to a root meaning to unite or to create, is the ram-headed god of the first cataract region, the ancient border zone around Aswan, where the Nile emerges from the granite outcroppings of Nubia into the smooth, navigable waters of Egypt proper. He was one of the oldest deities in Upper Egypt, attested from the early dynastic period, and his cult center at Elephantine Island in the Nile at Aswan was among the most ancient and continuously occupied sacred sites in Egypt, inhabited and used for religious purposes from the pre-dynastic period through the Roman era. Khnum is depicted as a man with the head of a ram, specifically the Egyptian flat-horned ram, Ovis longipes, which was the species kept in the Nile Valley before being gradually replaced by the curved horn species, Ovis aries, during the New Kingdom period. The flat-horned ram was ancient and associated with creative, generative power in Egyptian thought. The curved horn ram was more commonly associated with a moon. The distinction matters because Khnum's Ram iconography encodes a specifically ancient, locally rooted creative identity that differs from the cosmopolitan, theologically sophisticated creativity of the Amun tradition. Khnum's position at Elephantine gave him a specific and economically important function. He was understood to control the source of the Nile flood. The first cataract was the traditional southern boundary of Egypt proper, and the region from which the annual inundation appeared to originate, the flooding Nile coming from the south, through the cataracts, into the settled valley. Khnum was therefore the divine gatekeeper of Egypt's most essential resource. His goodwill was not optional. His cult at Elephantine received royal support across the entire span of pharaonic history, and the theological significance of his control over the flood was reflected in the famine stele, a Ptolemaic period inscription carved on the rocks of Sahel Island near Aswan, narrating a legendary 7-year famine during the reign of the Old Kingdom, Pharaoh Djoser, and its resolution through royal gifts to Khnum's temple at Elephantine. The stele's historicity is debated. It appears to be a much later document created to legitimize land grants to Khnum's priesthood, but it demonstrates the persistent theological weight of Khnum's role as flood controller. Khnum's most theologically striking function is his role as the divine potter who forms human beings, not only their physical bodies, but their spiritual doubles, the Ka, on a potter's wheel. This image, depicted in temple reliefs from numerous sites including Esna, Luxor, and Philae, shows Khnum seated at a potter's wheel, with two figures taking shape on its surface. The physical child and its Ka, formed simultaneously, identical in appearance, created together as an integrated unit. The goddess Hathor, or Heket, the frog-headed birth goddess, typically stands beside Khnum, holding the ahunk of life to the nostrils of the newly formed figures, animating them at the moment of their completion. The theological implications of this imagery are substantial. By positioning the formation of the individual human being as a divine craft act, the deliberate, skilled making of a specific person by a deity who worked with his hands, Egyptian theology invested every human birth with a dimension of divine intentionality. You were not a random product of biological processes. You were something Khnum had made, shaped on his wheel with specific attention, given a car that was uniquely yours. The quality and character of what Khnum produced varied, as the quality of any craftsman's output varies. But the act of production was always intentional and always divine. The potter's wheel as a metaphor for divine creation is not unique to Egypt. It appears in Mesopotamian creation texts and has distant analogues in other ancient traditions, but the Egyptian version is unusually specific and visually elaborated. Temple reliefs at Esna, the Ptolemaic Roman period Khnum temple at Esna in Upper Egypt, whose inscriptions are among the most extensively published of any Egyptian temple, thanks to the ongoing work of the Esna project under the direction of Christian Lights at the University of Tübingen, depict the creation of specific royal individuals on Khnum's wheel. The pharaoh and his Ka, formed with visible care, their royal crowns already in place on the wheel before birth. This royal application of the Khnum theology connected the general idea of divine craftsmanship to the specific political theology of the pharaohnate. The pharaoh was not merely a human king divinely authorized, but a being specifically and carefully crafted by the divine potter for his role. Neith, Egyptian net, a name possibly related to a word for water or alternatively to the word to weave, is among the most ancient deities in the Egyptian pantheon, with attestations from the pre-dynastic period and strong cult presence in the early dynastic era that suggests her worship predated the formal unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her primary cult center was Siisa in the western Nile Delta, and during the 26th dynasty, the Shetite period, approximately 664 to 525 BCE, when Egypt was ruled from Sais and experienced a notable cultural revival, Neith's status was elevated to near supreme prominence, and her theological profile was elaborated with considerable sophistication. Neith's symbols, a shield with two crossed arrows, or the weaving shuttle, encode her dual nature as warrior and creator. She was a goddess of war in the most ancient sense, not the war of political ambition, but the fundamental violence of creation, the cutting and separating and binding that brings form out of formlessness. She was also the goddess of weaving, an association that carried deep cosmological resonance in Egyptian thought. The loom as a model of creation, the interlacing of threads as a metaphor for the ordering of the world's diverse elements into coherent structure. The woven fabric that emerged from the loom was, in this reading, an image of Ma'at itself, order produced from multiplicity through skill and intention. Neith's androgynous nature. She is described in some texts as both male and female, as having created herself without a partner, as being the mother who was also a father, placed her outside the normal gender categories of Egyptian theology, and gave her a particularly fundamental creative status. Like a tomb, she was self-generated. Like Nun, she predated the conditions that made gender differentiation possible. The Shetite period theological elaborations of Neith's character pushed this in an explicitly philosophical direction. She was described as the first face, the primordial aspect of the divine before it differentiated into the multiple deities of the established pantheon. In this framing, all the other gods were aspects of Neith, expressions of her primordial nature in differentiated form. Neith occupied a specific and important role in Egyptian funerary practice as one of the 4 protective goddesses of the canopic chest, the container that held the embalmed internal organs of the deceased. The 4 goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket, the scorpion goddess, were assigned to the 4 corners of the chest, each protecting one of the 4 canopic jars within. Neith and Serket guarded the jars associated with Duamutef and Kebesenuf respectively, 2 of the 4 sons of Horus, the divine figures depicted on canopic jar lids, who protected the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines of the mummified dead. This funerary role placed Neith in regular, practical contact with Egyptian mortuary practice across all periods. Wherever there was a canopic chest, there were 4 protective goddess figures, and Neith was always one of them. The canopic chest and its contents were among the most carefully prepared components of Egyptian burial equipment, and the protective goddesses inscribed or painted on its sides were not decorative but functional. They were understood as actively preventing the decomposition or spiritual disorganization of the preserved organs, maintaining the physical completeness that was necessary for the deceased's resurrection. Neith, in this context, combined her warrior protective function with her creative function. She preserved what had been made. She maintained the integrity of what existed against the dissolving force of death. Her letter to the divine tribunal during the contendings of Horus and Set, which we discussed in episode 3, is one of the most characterful cameo appearances in Egyptian religious literature. The impatient, no-nonsense tone of Neith's letter, as transmitted through Thoth, reflects the theological confidence of a deity who predated the entire situation being adjudicated and who found the 80-year delay in resolving it somewhat beneath the dignity of the divine order. "Give Horus the throne," she wrote. "Compensate Set. Get on with things." The divine tribunal, receiving this communication from the oldest goddess in the pantheon, took it seriously. Khonsu, Egyptian Kenswu, meaning the wanderer or the traveler, a reference to the moon's movement across the sky, was the lunar deity of Thebes and the third member of the Theban triad, alongside Amun and Mut. His cult was centered at the Karnak temple complex, where a substantial temple dedicated to him, the Temple of Khonsu, largely built under Ramesses III and his successors in the 20th dynasty, approximately 1186 to 1069 BCE, and one of the best preserved complete temple structures in Egypt, stands within the Great Karnak precinct. Khonsu was depicted as a young man, often mummiform, wrapped in the linen bandages associated with mummification and divine stasis, wearing a distinctive headdress. The full lunar disk resting inside a crescent moon, both of which together rested on a wig or crown. The combination of the full moon and the crescent together, rather than one or the other, encoded Khonsu's identity as the complete lunar cycle, encompassing both the maximum light of the full moon and the defining curve of the crescent that marked the beginning and end of each cycle. A side lock of youth hung from one side of his head, indicating his status as a divine child, a characterization consistent with his position in the Theban triad as the son of Amun and Mut. As a lunar deity, Khonsu governed the measurement of time. The Egyptian religious calendar was lunisolar. The agricultural and civil calendar followed the solar year, while the scheduling of religious festivals was largely governed by lunar months. And Khonsu's authority over the moon made him, in practice, the divine administrator of festival timing. His connection to Thoth in this function, Thoth also being associated with the moon and with timekeeping, as we discussed in episode 2, reflects the general Egyptian pattern of allowing multiple deities to share domains that were sufficiently broad and important to warrant more than one divine administrator. Khonsu possessed a healing aspect that gave him a practical relevance in everyday Egyptian religious life, distinct from his calendrical function. He was invoked for healing, particularly for the treatment of possession by malevolent spirits, a category of illness that Egyptian medical thought recognized as distinct from physically caused disease and that required specifically divine rather than pharmaceutical intervention. The most elaborate surviving narrative of Khonsu's healing power is the Bentresh Stele, a late-period narrative inscription preserved in the Louvre c. 284, originally located in the Khonsu temple at Karnak, and dated on archaeological grounds to the 4th century BCE, though the narrative it recounts is set in the reign of Ramesses II, approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE. The Bentresh Stele narrates the story of a foreign princess, Bentresh, daughter of the king of Baktan, a kingdom sometimes identified with the Hittite realm, who was afflicted with an illness described as possession by a spirit. The king of Baktan, who had married his eldest daughter to Ramesses II, sent an embassy to Egypt requesting medical assistance. Egyptian physicians were dispatched, but found the case beyond their capacity. Ramesses II then sent a statue of Khonsu Neferhotep, a specific healing form of the god, which traveled to Bastet and successfully exorcised the possessing spirit. The spirit, departing, requested that a feast be held in its honor, which was granted, and Khonsu returned to Egypt loaded with gifts. The stele is not reliable historical documentation of an event from Ramesses II's reign. It is a late-period composition designed to publicize the healing power of Khonsu, and perhaps to legitimize the Khonsu temple's possession of certain foreign ritual objects. But its narrative assumptions are historically informative. It presupposes that divine statues could travel as diplomatic agents, that their efficacy against spirit possession was accepted as a matter of practical experience, and that the healing reputation of Khonsu was sufficiently established to make his statue a plausible solution to an intractable medical problem. The capacity of a divine statue to function as an active agent, not merely a representation but a presence, is fundamental to Egyptian religious thought and has implications that extend well beyond the Khonsu cult. Min, Egyptian Manu, a name of uncertain etymology, is one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, attested from the pre-dynastic period in colossal limestone statues recovered from Coptos, modern Kift, in Upper Egypt, now distributed between the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and the Cairo Egyptian Museum. These statues, carved from local limestone and reaching heights of approximately 4 meters, are among the oldest monumental sculptures in Egypt and among the earliest images of an identifiable deity in the archaeological record. Their precise date is debated, with estimates ranging from approximately 3,300 to 3,100 BCE, placing them in the Naqshta 2-3 period, before or at the very beginning of Egyptian writing. Min was the god of male fertility and sexual potency, depicted in a form that the Egyptians carved without evident embarrassment throughout the pharaonic period. A standing man with one arm raised and holding a flail, his body wrapped in tight white linen, with his phallus erect. The visual directness of his iconography reflected his theological directness. Min was the generative force of maleness, the divine embodiment of the sexual energy that produced children, caused crops to grow, and maintained the biological continuity of all living things. He was not a god of love in Hathor's warm and musical sense, but a god of the physical mechanism of reproduction, the raw, necessary energy that all life required. Min's cult center was Coptos, an important trading city that served as the starting point for expeditions into the eastern desert and toward the Red Sea coast, and Akhmim, ancient Ipu or Kent Apt, in Upper Egypt, where his temple remained an important religious institution through the Ptolemaic period. His association with Coptos connected him to the mineral resources of the eastern desert, the turquoise and copper of Signig, the gold of the Wadi Hammamat, the exotic goods arriving through the Red Sea, trade routes. Min was the patron of miners and of the desert expeditions that made these resources accessible, and his cult received support from the expeditions that departed from Coptos, which brought back offerings and inscriptions acknowledging his protection. The harvest festival of Min, the festival of the departure of Min, or simply the festival of Min, was one of the major state festivals of the New Kingdom, celebrated at the beginning of the harvest season. The ritual involved the pharaoh ceremonially cutting the first sheaf of emmer wheat in Min's honor, releasing a white bull, Min's sacred animal, and performing a sequence of ritual actions that connected royal authority to agricultural fertility through the divine mediation of Min. The harvest was not merely an agricultural event, but a divine one. It was Min's fertility, expressed through the pharaoh's ritual action, that had produced the grain, and the festival acknowledged this properly. Mut, Egyptian Mut, meaning simply mother, was the great mother goddess of Thebes, the divine consort of Amun, and the mother of Khonsu. And through these relationships, the queen of the Theban divine triad that dominated Egyptian religion during the New Kingdom period. Her cult center was the temple of Mut at Karnak, the Mut precinct, located to the south of the main Amun-Ra temple complex, and connected to it by the great avenue of human-headed sphinxes, which enclosed a crescent-shaped sacred lake called Isharu, and a substantial temple complex that was continually expanded and elaborated from the 18th dynasty onward. Mut's iconography is less visually distinctive than that of most major Egyptian deities. She is typically depicted as a woman wearing the double crown of United Egypt, the combined white crown of Upper Egypt, and the red crown of Lower Egypt, and a vulture headdress, the latter being a characteristic marker of queenly and motherly goddesses in Egyptian iconography. The vulture, specifically the griffin vulture, Gyps fulvus, was associated with maternity in Egyptian thought on the basis of an ancient belief that all vultures were female and reproduced through the wind, a belief documented in texts including the Physiologus and referenced in Egyptian medical papyri. The vulture therefore represented parthenogenetic motherhood, the capacity to produce life from oneself alone, which made it an appropriate symbol for a divine mother who encompassed the maternal principle in its most absolute form. Mut's personality in Egyptian religious texts is more queenly than maternal in the domestic sense. She is the consort of the supreme god, the divine equivalent of the great royal wife, and her authority derives from this position rather than from the more intimate, protective mothering that characterizes goddesses like Isis. She was associated with royal power, with the legitimacy that the divine mother conferred on the pharaoh, and with the protective authority of the vulture hovering above. New Kingdom queens were closely identified with Mut. The title, Great Royal Wife, carried Mutian associations, and the queen's headdress in royal iconography frequently incorporated the vulture that was Mut's characteristic emblem. Mut also possessed a leonine form that connected her to the solar eye tradition and to Sekhmet specifically. The Mut precinct at Karnak, as archaeological excavation has established, housed a large proportion of the Sekhmet statues commissioned by Amenhotep III. The 700 statue program discussed earlier in this episode, suggesting a formal theological connection between Sekhmet and Mut that went beyond mere iconographic similarity. Both were solar eye goddesses in their fiercer aspect. Both were associated with the destructive potential of the solar force, and the placement of Sekhmet's statues in Mut's precinct may reflect a theological identification of the two as aspects of the same divine feminine solar power, differentiated by context and function, but ultimately continuous. We have moved tonight through the broader divine court, the love and solar power of Hathor, the therapeutic ferocity of Sekhmet, the domesticated warmth of Bastet, the river danger and primordial creation of Sobek, the careful craftsmanship of Khnum, the ancient authority of Neith, the lunar timekeeping of Khonsu, the blunt fertility of Min, and the queenly maternity of Mut. These are the gods that filled the everyday spaces of Egyptian life, the amulets on the body, the prayers at the household shrine, the festivals that marked the turning of the year. In episode 5, we complete the series with the great builder gods, the supreme Amun at the height of his power, and the divine bureaucracy of the afterlife in its full institutional detail. The pantheon is nearly assembled. Only the capstone remains. The sistrum has fallen quiet. The sacred lake is still. The cats are sleeping. Rest.